Welcome to today's New England Hymns webinar presented by premier sponsor Wolf & Company, titled Business Continuity, an Essential Piece to the Overall Emergency Management Puzzle, presented by Tracy Hall, MD, MBCP, CHP, CP, Senior Manager with Wolf & Company. Tracy leads the firm's business continuity planning team. As one of the leading business continuity planning experts in the country, she assists clients with BCP audits and assessments, business impact analysis, plans development and maintenance training and awareness, disaster recovery tests, and simulation exercises. Tracy has over 20 years of experience in the field and helps clients across multiple industries increase their resiliency and recover following disruptions or disasters. She also is a popular speaker both regionally and nationally and has authored articles on pertinent topics related to BCP. When Tracy's not at work, she enjoys traveling, spending time with family and friends, and supporting her son's many activities. All lines have been muted upon entry, so please send them via the Q&A feature today, and Tracy will answer them during the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Tracy.
Hello, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm also joined by Doug Girth, who is part of our business development group, who's going to just say a few words about Wolf & Company and some upcoming events I think that we're going to be doing with HIMSS before I sort of dive into today's presentation.
Thanks, Tracy. So for those of you who don't know, Wolf & Company is a 112-year-old CPA firm. We have over 350 individuals now with the company. We have people probably represented in 20 plus states and clients in about 47 states. Our four offices are primarily main offices in Boston. We have people in Springfield, Albany, New York, and Livingston, New Jersey. And we're three different lines of service, basically tax, audit, and Tracy and I are a part of the risk management group, or IT assurance. I've had the pleasure of working with Tracy now for over 5 years, and knew her before that. I worked for a competitor. She's very knowledgeable. I didn't know you could get your master's in business continuity, but Tracy does have that. So I'll turn it back over to Tracy, and thanks for your time.
Yes, and
I forgot to mention that we will be at the New England HIMSS event on June 8th in Norwood, so we hope to see you there.
Excellent. And I also just want to mention that very last bullet too. We also do have an automated risk management suite product. So we work with our clients on a variety of different risk management initiatives, including IT risk assessments, third-party risk assessments, compliance work, business continuity, incident management, and we do have an automated platform that sort of brings all of that together. So just to give you a little bit more idea of our experience, with those 350 plus people, we do have a lot of subject matter expertise and longevity within the industry and within risk management specifically. So thank you very much, Doug. Just a little bit more about my background, and that was a great introduction. But, I have been here with the firm for almost 10 years and service many different industries that we work with. Healthcare is one of the largest, and I think a lot of it is mainly driven by some of the regulations that require business continuity to be part of your operational and strategic planning. And we'll talk about that a little bit in just a moment. But my background, you name the industry, I've worked in it. I know that the initials that we went over in the beginning, they're kind of a mouthful, but basically I do have my master level certification in business continuity management. And I also have a certification that's specific to continuity for healthcare practitioners. So, because of all of the work that I do in the healthcare space, the certification really helps us to bring our services to the next level. Again, please feel free to, as we said, put Q&A in either in the Q&A or the chat. Doug will help monitor that as well, so that we can answer your questions as we're talking to the topic, as we're going along. So for today's agenda, I'm going to start off kind of with just some statistics report type of stuff that says, justifies why business continuity. We'll talk a little bit about the regulations that mention the requirement for business continuity and or emergency management specific to how it looks in a healthcare organization. And then talking about foundational elements to a comprehensive business continuity plan and some of the things that you need to consider in your program, not just specific to the documentation itself. So when we talk about business continuity, I'm thinking that everyone is here either because they're somewhat responsible for business continuity within the organization that you represent, or you've just been told that you're going to be inheriting the business continuity program, which I know just brings a lot of joy to a lot of people. I also recognize that I'm probably the most excited person when it comes to business continuity on calls like this. So hopefully you will walk away with a better understanding of whatever questions that you had coming to this. I am always available outside of this. My contact information will be repeated at the end. Please feel free to reach out. But when we talk about business continuity, we're specifically talking about plans, procedures, resources established to maintain and or recover mission critical processes and services impacted by an event that causes an interruption to normal operations. So a lot of times when people ask me, what type of things should we be planning for? I always say it's really difficult to think about every scenario that you can potentially plan for. If you try to do that, I think that, Murphy's Law is going to be the one that you don't plan for is the one that is going to happen. So we sort of in our practice break this into 4 different areas. We break it into events that can cause loss of facilities, loss of systems, loss of personnel, and loss of third-party providers. That was added a handful of years ago just because, we're really recognizing what a dependency that we have on our outside providers. But I think that if your plans can address interruption to operations specific to one or more of those different categories, thinking about the nuances of every single potential thing that could happen, every threat that could happen, you'll be planning from now until forever, and you won't even get to the finish line. There are certainly nuances. I think that when you do your risk assessments, which we'll talk about in a minute, that need to be planned out for a little bit more. Things that are higher probability for you to happen, I think, need to have some additional procedures and things written. But these are the 4 buckets that we really recommend that you focus on when you're doing your planning. I think you'll be pretty well covered if you can do that. Whenever I do public speaking, anytime I ask the question, why are we here? Why are we doing this? The number one answer that I get in regulated industries, which, mainly for us is healthcare and financial institutions, is because we have to, right? So we do understand that there's a regulatory component to this, but there are also patient expectations. It's industry best practice. And it's really about protecting the patient's business assets. And we talk about assets. It's not just things that are tangible that you can hold on to. It's also about data. It's about relationships. And also the big thing today, especially when cybersecurity comes into the fold, is really protecting your reputation. So a little bit about some statistics. This is a 2002 article that I found that basically says that there were 2 studies that were cited. One found 96% of organizations reported at least one unplanned IT system downtime. I think it was, when you read the whole article, it was a lot more than that, but at least one at all of the organizations that they polled. The other study found that 70% of organizations reported at least one unplanned outage that lasted 9 or more hours. And then between 2020 and 2022, the VA experienced 52 occurrences in which the EHR system had been partly or completely unusable. So 52 occurrences, that's a lot when you're talking about, a 2-year period. And then, like I alluded to before, the number of ransomware attacks in healthcare organizations has increased 94% from 2021 to 2022. That's a significant jump. And I think that COVID has something to do with that, because we do know that the amount of attacks substantially increased during that time, but 94% is a significant jump. Another industry report, I'm not going to read through all of the data, but you get the feel here, right? About 90%, 97% of IT professionals reporting downtime. I think that down at the bottom, when we talk about the estimated cost of downtime, ranges between $5,300 and $9,000 per minute. Loss of revenue and productivity, compromised data, patient safety, brand and reputation damage. So there's a lot at stake here when you're talking about system downtime and the information that you're unable to access during that downtime. Talking about regulations a little bit. Again, I'm not going to read all of this. I put this in here because you guys will get the slide deck after, and I think it's got some good information in it. But basically, from the Joint Commission states that the hospital has to have a continuity of operations plan. And there's some different components to that. When we talk about continuity of operations planning, it is synonymous with business continuity planning. It's just more widely used in the healthcare and government space. It also states that the hospital has to have a disaster recovery plan. So when we talk about disaster recovery, we're speaking about the technology component of that continuity of operations plan or business continuity plan. Sometimes they're separate. A lot of times now within the industry, we see them under the same umbrella as one larger plan. But disaster recovery is sort of the original term that when this really became a thing years ago. I got into the industry. I loved how you said over 20 years ago. It's my standing joke. Because as I get older, I'm just going to continue. I'm going to retire someday with over 20 years of experience, because it won't be a lie. And I'll feel as though I'm not tracking the years as they go by me. But disaster recovery planning is really that legacy IT technology component of your emergency and readiness preparedness. CMS also requires different emergency management plans, that I've highlighted here. So, I think that this gives us applicable standards from the HIPAA security rule, making sure that there's a contingency plan, data backup plan, disaster recovery plan, emergency mode operation plan, etc. And then there's some applicable standards also from the HITRUST framework. So I think that this helps to set the stage with, there are definitely regulatory agencies that are governing the healthcare space that see that this is super important. Okay. And I do want to think about this as not just the have to have, but, all of the other things, the best practices, the protecting the business, protecting the reputation. So when we look at the structure, the emergency management structure within a healthcare organization, I want to first point out something that you're probably familiar with, the hospital incident command system. And just to note that this is massive, right? So this is an incident command system to really look at how does a hospital or healthcare organization respond to an emergency throughout the organization. But I wanted to point out here that business continuity is definitely a piece of this. Okay, so it's only one piece of this larger puzzle. And I think that that's the perspective that I want everyone to take away, is that this really should be developed and working in concert with your overall emergency management program. So, there's a lot of moving pieces and parts to this when you're talking about how do we respond to an emergency event? Who needs to be involved and what are their different tasks and responsibilities? Business continuity is really something that comes in when we're talking about an operational interruption. Could be that systems are down, but something that impacts our ability to conduct operations on a normal basis, okay? So we're going to drill down on this a little bit and look more at the emergency management structure in a healthcare organization. So if you look at this, what the emergency management and business continuity framework specific to healthcare states is that there are some, again, different components. Now we've drilled down from the incident command center system, and now we're really looking at the emergency management and BCP framework itself. Typically within a healthcare organization, we see three different things. Could be more, but we see three different things. What's called an emergency operations plan. So that's sort of this overarching plan that regardless of what the situation is that's happening, this is the plan that would be activated first. Okay, so the big piece of this is where individual procedures for some of those highly likely incidents you're probably going to find it. But if you look at the arrow that I have here, the big thing is ensuring that crisis management has a place within the overall structure. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about that, but crisis management is really about how do we initially respond to this event. It includes communications, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. Over to the right, I also added on incident response. I think that as we continue to evolve and our threat landscape continues to get greater, the biggest area that we see increasing as far as risk and level of concern is when we talk about cybersecurity. So I can't talk about business continuity without making reference to incident response planning, which is specific to those cyber events and how we respond to those. So you've got different playbooks, for ransomware and malware and et cetera. But really what I see happening in the industry is that we're starting to really bridge this gap between the two. Okay. And why is that? When you look at what this structure looks like, one of the things that we do with a lot of our healthcare organization clients that we work with is we do a full review of the emergency management structure, specific to BCP, crisis management, and IRP. And what we find is a lot of times there's a lot of inconsistencies. The emergency operating plan is often, governed by a different role or position person than the BCP as well as the IRP. So a lot of times we'll see facilities as responsible for the EOP, and BCP might be an operations person, could be IT. IRP is usually somewhere in the technology space. But what we want to make sure is that all of these plans are speaking to each other and there aren't any inconsistencies, because a lot of times we find that there's a crisis management component to each of these plans. And you know what? They're not the same. And the players are not the same. So then what happens when you actually have an incident and you need to respond? And there are people thinking that they're doing all of the same activities. Not that that's always a bad thing, but sometimes redundancy can cause confusion. Okay. You also have to remember, and I'm going to say this again throughout the presentation, BCP events can often cause cybersecurity events. So if a system is down, these hackers are much smarter than you and I. So they know you're having an operational issue. The first thing they're going to realize is that your system is not being monitored. Your environment is not being monitored to the best of its abilities. Also, cybersecurity attacks can cause BCP events, because a lot of times what we see is that the systems are taken down and offline. So now we have to have both of these plans operational, working in concert, but there has to be a consistent crisis management structure to the overall organization. When we talk about a business continuity program specifically, we're talking about creating a steering committee, doing a business impact analysis, risk assessment, creating the plan, making sure that you're conducting awareness and training. So the people that you are assigning roles and responsibilities within these plans actually know what's expected of them if one of these events were to occur. It's important to remember you have to test, maintain the plan ongoingly, and have regular reviews from an audit, etc. So when we talk about a steering committee, the definition here is that a steering committee is tasked with making strategic recovery and continuity planning decisions for the organization. One of the things that I like to always hone in on is making sure that that committee is representative of the entire organization. Now, I don't mean that you need to have, 60 people on this committee, but enough people who can speak to enough areas within the organization. Because what I find is that outages speak differently to different business areas, right? Or, clinical teams, et cetera. So we want to make sure that the information from the administrative and clinical areas is being fed up appropriately to the steering committee so that the decisions that the steering committee are making are actually assisting the challenges that the organization is facing at the time. One of the biggest things that we're finding in the healthcare space is that a lot of the prospects and clients that we're speaking with are saying, it's been a really long time since we've conducted a thorough business impact analysis. So what is a BIA? It's the process of identifying and prioritizing business functions and the resources required to support them in predefined recovery time objectives. We call those RTOs. So they're basically timeframes for recovery. The exercise is considered to be post-outage. And what I mean by that is it's not taking into an account like, oh, this is a fire, or this is a flood, or this is a cybersecurity. There may be some little nuances that have to be noted within the BIA, but basically what you're trying to determine is what does that prioritized recovery approach look like if we do have an outage, because we can't recover everything all at the same time, right? So we want to identify first, what are the resources we need? How critical are they? When do we need them? And I've been doing this for so long that I can tell you I have never worked with an organization who going through this process, because then what we do is after we meet with the business, we do an entire reconciliation piece with the technology group. And there has never been a time where that hasn't spoken to someone saying, we don't even know what that system is. How can we support the recovery of it? We're not sure who has access to it, where it sits, where it resides. Do we have the proper infrastructure to recover it if it's that critical? So there are a lot of things that come out when you're really looking under the hood in a true BIA that you realize you've got gaps within your recovery strategy. And is there a question there? I saw a notification pop up, but I can't get back to the.
Would you like me to read it, Tracy? Sorry,
I
was waiting for you to break. Sorry.
No, that would be great.
It says, it is anonymous, but it asks, what would be the maximum steering committee members you would recommend?
That's a great question, but one hard to answer. So I think it really depends on the size of the organization. What I usually do with my clients, if they haven't formed a steering committee yet, we look at the organizational chart, right? Or the organizational structure of the organization. And again, it's not always about making sure you have, this person and everybody but someone at some level, and it's not always the highest level, right? Because what you want is people who can kind of really speak to the day-to-day in and outs of things. What I find is the top executive level folks are usually a lot more strategic in the business and the things that they're concerned about or what they're responsible for. So maybe it's the next management layer down. But just, even if someone is on that steering committee and there's 3 business areas that report into that person, you just want to make sure that there's someone who can be the voice for that business area back to the executives, right? And back to that group who has to make those decisions. So that there's not some group that's forgotten about. So I know I'm not exactly answering your question because I can't give you a number. The size of the organizations that are on this call probably vary drastically. It could be 6 or 8 people, and it could be, 12 to 15 people. I can't speak to that, but really using your organizational chart to find the level that has a lot of experience with the day-to-day operations and also has some authority and decision-making power. I hope that answered the question. And if not, I'd be happy to talk about it offline as well. Okay, when we talk about a risk assessment, a lot of times in healthcare, this is called an all hazards assessment based on guidance language. This is about analyzing a variety of different threats, natural threats, man-made threats, cyber threats, pandemic threats, and really assessing what is the probability of this specific threat occurring and what's the impact to the organization if it were to occur. Okay. It's considered a pre-outage exercise, which means nothing has happened yet. What we're trying to do in this exercise is identify the highest likelihood of things that might happen, so that we know that we are applying the most appropriate controls to lessen the probability or impact of those things happening. This is one area, in healthcare prior to COVID and somewhat now, we really would focus on the most critical administrative sites, the people who were running the organization, but not clinically. Now, post-COVID, if we have a lot of organizations who have people working from home or a distributed work environment, we're a little bit more creative. Maybe we talk about the data center being the most critical location, but this is one concept in the work that we do that has changed a little bit post-COVID, because our reliance, not on the hospitals itself or where the patient care happens, but the reliance on physical buildings may not be what they were prior to 2020. This is just a sample sort of table of contents, very high level about what should be in your actual plan itself. That the crisis management piece needs to be part of that executive oversight, or at least have something, if the crisis management component sits in the emergency operating plan, making sure that you speak back to it. It's okay to duplicate it. Some people don't like to do that. There has to be the DR component. So that recovery strategy, all of the IT information, that their roles and responsibilities, making sure that all the critical systems are accounted for in the BIA process. And then at the very bottom, one of the things that we always see forgotten, especially when we get hired a lot to do assessments of programs. And one of the big things we find is that there isn't a lot of information about restoration, whether it be physical restoration of sites, operational restoration, restoration of equipment and office supplies. We focus a lot on the recovery piece, but there's a lot that has to happen when you're restoring back to normal operations. So if your plans don't include that, make sure you go back and think about what are all of the things, including testing and certification of systems once they're back up and running in a production environment, making sure that the site is secure, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this probably, the more I'm thinking about this should have come maybe a little bit higher up, but, crisis management, just to talk about that a little bit more, there has to be some consistency, regardless of the type of scenario. There are going to be differences in the way that you respond once you understand what it is that's happening, what I'm talking about is that very initial response. The executive leadership gets notification that something has occurred. There has to be a consistent way that the organization responds to an unexpected event, so that, everyone on that steering committee is having input, and that all of the areas of the organization are accounted for. When we talk about crisis management, some of the objectives is, number one, demonstrating concern for human safety and well-being. I do a talk specific to crisis management, and I've got a lot of case studies, and I'm sure you can find a bunch out there on Google, of actual events that have happened where the crisis management activities were probably not on par where they should have been, and a lot of reputational damage occurred to the organization. But making sure that you're demonstrating concern for human safety and well-being needs to be priority in your response, in your initial communications. Making sure that you're disseminating critical and accurate information in a timely manner. Okay, and that might be different depending on what the situation is. We'll talk about that in a second. Making sure that you can streamline your response and recovery efforts, protect your company assets, minimizing impact and loss, and maintaining a positive reputation to the best of your ability. Now, when we talk about communications, one of the things that I do find in my assessment work or audit work is that there's really great communication strategies and plans for the initial communications of an event. However, there needs to be some responsibility and communication plans throughout the event, okay? Making sure you have a command center, even if it's virtual. Nowadays, that's the norm, but it can't just be for the onset of an incident. It has to be ongoing. Frequency of communication. What are the trigger points? So what are we looking for to happen? Is it a change in the scenario? Is it another system gets affected? Establishing what are those trigger points that we need to identify. That means it's time for additional communications to occur. Making sure that you have multiple communication vehicles, so don't rely on just one tool. You may have mass communication tools for internal and some of your external communications. You may do, external email. You may have something up on your website. You may use social media. Know your audience. That's another big thing. I always talk about, when I talk about crisis communications, when we look at the different social media tools that we have, if you look at LinkedIn and you look at Facebook and you look at Twitter, and even people use Instagram and Snapchat for some of these things, or TikTok. I'm seeing that which is crazy to me, but know the audience that's going to be using the social media that you're communicating through. The message will be the same, but the way that you say it might be different. Making sure you know how to get your contact lists, have responsibility for initiating and continuing those communications, both internally and externally, okay? And make sure that you have the right frequency of contact information updates. That should really go in line with the percentage of turnover or the frequency of turnover in your organization. The last thing you want to do is go and start contacting a bunch of people and realize that you don't have the right phone number, to get in touch with them. And then here's one of the biggest things that I talk about when I talk about crisis response, crisis communications. I have some case studies that I do where I show, here's how the company responded on Twitter. And you want to make sure that you're including levels of assurance. And what I mean by that, if we're in a healthcare organization and the EHR is down, we want to make sure that we're communicating that patient information is safe. If it's not safe because it was a breach, that's a different story. But wherever you can, and if you've confirmed that the outage is not because of a cybersecurity breach, that's something to say, right? Wherever you can make the target audience that you're speaking to feel some relief, you want to make sure that you have that in your outgoing communications. Make sure you include the who, what, when, where, how, and why. Tell what you know when you know it, and what you don't know when you don't know it. So if you are not sure when you're going to be back up and running, don't rely on a we think so. Don't say 2 to 4 hours if you are not sure. You can say a statement that says, we are working to the best of our ability to see how quickly we can get this resolved and back up and running, and we will update you as soon as we have more information. Don't be afraid to say the things that you don't know, because when you try to make that information into something you think you know, and then you don't meet that, that's going to cause issues later. Collaborate internally and externally for communications. Always get legal advice, regardless of what the situation is. Admit fault where where it's appropriate. And towards the end, as you're wrapping up, talk about how you've learned from the situation. And again, I can talk about several different scenarios where, I've followed events where I never heard anyone, executive from the company come out and say, this is how we've learned from the situation, and this is how we know we're not going to do this again. Okay, personnel recovery. This is probably one of my biggest areas of concern coming out of the pandemic. And again, on the clinical side, it's, people have to be where the patients are. Your physicians, et cetera, have to be where the patients are to service them. But when we talk about administrative back office people, your BIA should have a documented required number of critical people to keep the business unit up and running, broken down into different timeframes, so that you're sort of staggering the approach to recovery. You want to consider actual recovery locations. I'm going to skip to the bottom here. One of the biggest concerns that I have is seeing organizations say that, well, now that everybody can work from home, we don't need a backup location because we know that people can work remotely. And if you work in a hybrid environment or people are geographically dispersed, one of the things that I would want you to be considering is what happens when the work from home option is not possible. So if they work from home primarily and then they can't, where are they going to? And if something happens to the facility that they work in and you expect them to work from home, but because of the nature of an event, let's say it's a widespread, ice storm, hurricane, et cetera, and people can't work from home because there's widespread power outages, what do you do then? So I've heard a lot of organizations that I've worked with in the last few years say, oh, we're getting rid of our backup locations. We don't need them. Everybody's going to work from home. And I say, well, you want to make sure that you have power then in your primary facilities, so that if there is a widespread outage, making it impossible for people to work remotely, you have a plan for that. Okay. And then making sure that you have the proper infrastructure to support whatever that personnel recovery strategy is, whether they're working at other internal locations, whether they're working remotely. I think that we kind of came a long way in the last few years. But again, consider scenarios where the primary place of where they're working is unavailable to them, and maybe working remotely is not an option because they don't have a generator at home. So again, one of the biggest areas of concern that I see with mistakes being made in recovery of personnel. Outsourcing. This is just to highlight how important it is to do your vendor due diligence. What can go wrong? They can disappear, go out of business, give you bad information, lose your information, cause security exposures, underdeliver, and they might be unprepared for a disaster. So my point of this slide is, we do a lot of outsourcing nowadays. I would venture to say that the majority of companies now are either approaching or have gone over the hump of larger percentage of outsourced systems than ones that they handle internally. Make sure that you're asking for SOC reports, you're asking for business continuity plans, you're asking for testing information, so that you have that level of assurance that the organization has actually tested it and can say, yes, we can support what our service level agreement to you is. We've talked about this a lot, but cybersecurity events, making sure that you include them in your BCP and risk assessment, cross-reference those two plans for inconsistency, incorporate cyber scenarios in testing. We do a lot of threat emulation exercises at Wolf & Company for our clients, but you can also satisfy that requirement by doing tabletop, scenario simulations. That's how a lot of our clients will test their incident response plans, because it's not just about, if the system crashes because of the breach or whatever, then your BCP is going to be activated to get that system up and running. But what about all the other things, right? That crisis management component, if it's ransomware, are we going to pay the ransom? Have we ever had that conversation? And what role does your insurance company play in the response and recovery effort? And is that incorporated into your incident response plan? Okay, so that's another big thing that we're seeing is the role of the insurance company sometimes is so great, but it's not documented. So that's unclear in the organization where the organization's responsibility stops and where the insurance company picks up. Testing. This should be just an at least annual piece of this puzzle for you. I'm a fan of more frequent dynamic testing. A lot of the regulators like to see that as well. Meaning, if you do smaller component testing throughout the course of the year, just to show that you can change up the scenario and change up the systems that you are incorporating. I believe in multi-year test plans. I don't think they should be more than 3 years because I think that environments change too quickly. I worked with a client once who we were auditing their test plan and they brought to us a 10-year test plan. And the reality was when we looked back and had conversations about how often they added systems or decommissioned systems, it wasn't 10 years. So they needed to kind of sharpen their pencil on what that multi-year test plan looked like. Rotate technologies of very criticality. Sometimes the low criticalities don't get incorporated into the test plan because they're so low and their RTOs are so far out that you say, you know what, we'll be able to do this during a test. Must include supporting infrastructure. If you're doing a test and you're trying to test that a system is going to be recovered in X amount of time, you have to make sure that you are not just making an assumption that the supporting infrastructure is available. So if there's infrastructure and other systems that need to be up and running prior to building that system again or bringing it back online, make sure that the RTOs, the recovery times for the supporting infrastructure, is calculated into that overall RTO for that system. Make sure that you're referencing that BIA. That BIA should be updated on an annual basis so that you're not missing any new systems. You can do evacuation drills, communication drills, structured walkthroughs of your plan, where we actually sit down with folks with the plan in front of them and go through the different pieces of it and talk about people's responsibilities and roles. And does this make sense? It kind of satisfies awareness and training at the same time. Simulation testing, I talked about this. This is a huge piece of our business. We do this all the time, and ransomware is like the #1 ask right now. So what we do is get a group of folks together. Again, I always say experience and authority, right? We would work with you learning the organizational structure as to who should be involved. We pick a scenario, we walk through and try to incorporate the loss of building technology people. I have to add third-party providers there. These are great because what this does, when you do a disaster recovery test, you're just assuming that, okay, there's been a disaster, we've declared it, and now we need to recover. What the DR test doesn't take a look at a lot of times is all of the decisions that need to be made up to the point where you declare that we have a disaster and we need to invoke our plans. The communication, the organization, et cetera. So it tests the entire timeline of your event. And it really brings together technology in the business. You should be doing that in your DR testing as well. Business units should be participating. The user community should be participating in those DR tests. But simulation testing, again, it is a huge offering of ours. And people walk away with things come out of that we could never even have thought would come out of it. So it's a really great way to sit there and talk about a scenario against the program that you have in place. We just talked about technology testing. This is the disaster recovery testing, basically the recovery of systems. Ongoing maintenance, your business continuity plan, as well as all of the other emergency management plans within the organization, your EOPs, your crisis management plans, your incident response plans, really should be updated at least yearly, or as major changes occur to the organization or to the environment. Okay, sometimes if you've got rapid changes going on, you don't want to wait yearly. You want to have some sort of culture that says, if this were to happen, we know that we can incorporate this as quickly as possible. Because if you try to wait in some organizations till the end of the year, whatever that month of the year is, you're going to be doing a lot of work and you're going to be reinventing a lot of wheels. So sometimes people put it in like, if there's a major change within the organization, how does this impact our business continuity plan, incident response plan, emergency operations plan, etc. And then just to wrap this up, one of the things is regular independent reviews of plans, testing. A lot of times this is audit responsibility, but just making sure that somebody who's outside of the process is taking a look at that. We do this again for a lot of our clients, and it's nice to have a fresh set of eyes, but a different perspective who's not within the organization, who can make recommendations to the organization for, where I would probably change things, how I would structure this a little bit differently. And we can bring insight, and when I say we, not just Wolf, but the outside parties can bring insight to that, maybe because you're on the inside and you're responsible for the development of the plan, you're not necessarily seeing it. Okay, I think that's the end of our presentation, and I do think we have about 10 or so minutes left. If there are any questions, comments, anything about, even if there's something you want to share with the group. A lot of times I love when there's a little bit of information sharing around how you handle something within your organization that might be helpful to the group.
So feel free to go ahead and put your question or comment, as Tracy said, into the Q&A so that we can respond or give some feedback. And while we're waiting for those thoughts to percolate, I'd like to thank Tracy for taking the time to present to the group today. And as you exit, we would welcome your feedback. There is a very short Zoom survey, and there's also a place there if you think of another question for Tracy, I can communicate that with her as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
So don't forget to register. As Doug said, they will be at the upcoming spring conference, which is less than 2 weeks away. It is, or just about 2 weeks away. It's on June 8th at the 4 Point Sheraton, and we'll be having 2 tracks focusing on clinical informatics and digital health. And we'll be ending with a reception for more networking featuring live jazz, a photo booth, cocktails, and appetizers. So hopefully everybody will be able to join us. And Tracy, I don't have any questions at this time. Oh, one chat saying this was a great presentation. Thank you so much, Tracy. So
Thank you.
I'll give everyone back a few minutes of their day. And thanks, Tracy. And hopefully we'll see you as well at the spring conference if you have time.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Doug, as well. I know.
Thank you.